Good afternoon. I'm Tracy Gordon, Vice President of Tax Policy at the Urban Institute and co-director of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you to How Does the IRS Intend to Invest $80 billion over the next decade? This year's symposium in honor of an extraordinary public servant, Donald C. Lubick. Don served twice as Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy at the US Treasury Department. Through positions at Treasury, the International Monetary Fund, and Harvard University, he helped countries from the Dominican Republic to former Soviet states modernize their tax systems to promote efficiency, fairness, and growth. Don's deep knowledge and integrity earned him the respect and admiration of his colleagues at Treasury and the White House and the Hill across both sides of the aisle and throughout the tax community. He was widely viewed as a teacher, mentor, and friend, and he is greatly missed. Since 2016, the Tax Policy Center has been proud to host a symposium in Don's honor. Today, we continue that tradition and welcome Don's many friends and family members, especially Susan Lubick, his wife of more than 60 years. We are grateful to have all of you with us today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. We are broadcasting and recording this event. The recording, slides, and additional content will be shared after the event. We've enabled live captions, and they can be turned on by clicking the CC button on the bottom right corner of your media player. We want to engage with the audience both online and in person. To ask questions as a virtual attendee, please put your question in the Q&A box at any time. For those of you attending in person, you can access the event dashboard using the QR codes on the tables. Please contact events@urban.org if you need assistance. If you would like to join the conversation on Twitter, please use the hashtag #live@urban. Lastly, we'd love your feedback. Afterwards, we'll be emailing a link to a post-event survey, and we ask that you please fill it out to help us shape future events. Now, on to our program. This month, the IRS released an eagerly anticipated blueprint for how it intends to spend an $80 billion budget boost made possible through last year's Inflation Reduction Act. The plan includes bold initiatives to improve taxpayer service, resolve filing issues in real time, step up audits of complex, high-income individual and corporate returns, replace outdated IT systems, and attract and retain a skilled and diverse workforce. The plan also leaves some questions unanswered. How will the IRS implement Treasury Secretary Yellen's pledge not to increase audits of taxpayers earning less than $400,000 a year? When can we expect details on hiring and procurement beyond the next 2 fiscal years? And beyond the plan, how will Congress respond, including by handling annual discretionary appropriations that the IRS says are also vital to achieving its objectives? To address these questions and more, we have a stellar set of speakers. First, it's my pleasure to introduce Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Wally Adeyemo. Adeyemo serves as the Treasury Department's #2 official and Chief Operating Officer. He has taken a leading role in Treasury's national security, economic inequality, and pandemic-related economic recovery work. This is Adeyemo's second tour at the Treasury Department. He was previously a senior advisor and deputy chief of staff, as well as chief negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership's macroeconomic provisions. From 2015 to 2017, Adeyemo served as Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. He was also the first Chief of Staff for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. After leaving government in 2017, Adeyemo served as the first president of the Obama Foundation and then a senior advisor for the Center for Strategic and International Studies and at BlackRock. He attended the University of California at Berkeley, go Bears, and Yale Law School. Joining Deputy Secretary Adeyemo will be Urban Institute President Sarah Rosen Wartell. Wartell is the third president of the Urban Institute since its founding in 1968. Before joining Urban, she was the founding chief operating officer and then executive vice president of the Center for American Progress, where her work focused on the economy and housing. While in the public sector, she served as deputy assistant to the president for economic policy and deputy director of the National Economic Council. She was also a housing finance and consumer protection advisor at the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. Before her government service, Wartell practiced law at Arnold & Porter. She holds degrees from Princeton University, Yale Law School, and an honorary doctorate of public service from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Many thanks to you both for joining us today.
There we go. Traffic jam. Hey, everybody. So let's jump right in. As Tracy just said, you are not only a policy lead on lots of things, some of which, like racial equity, we'll talk about here, but you also run the operations of the very large department. And I think it's become part of the American culture to think about the IRS as sort of under-resourced. And in fact, I think that for some was a policy choice to limit the capacity to fulfill those functions. And as I suspect this audience knows, the IRS budget shrank by about a quarter in real terms over the last year. Over the last decade, and when adjusted for inflation. And the audit rates and customer service, we hear about that on the news all the time. It's been an enormous, enormous problem. The Inflation Reduction Act, as everyone knows, provided you an additional $80 billion over 10 years for hiring, IT upgrades, and lots of capacity building for two primary purposes: to close the tax gap and to greatly improve customer service. And one of the first things you've done is to hire about 5,000 new people, all before the beginning of the year. I should say I spent my weekend, probably clicked on the IRS website about 40 or 50 times as I was doing my own estimates because I was late on my extension, getting it to my accountant. And so I had to do it myself. And I can say that it is better, but still a ways to go. So from your perspective, how's the filing season going? And what's your plan to further improve the services?
Well, Sarah, let me start out by saying thank you to you and the Tax Policy Center for hosting this conversation. And I want to say how grateful we are, those of us who are policymakers, for having neutral arbiters who help in some way to provide us with ground truths in terms of information for the policy debates that we have in this country. And this is that type of conversation that I think is truly so helpful. As you know, when the Inflation Reduction Act passed, the Secretary asked the Commissioner to work with me in producing an operating plan in terms of how this money will be spent in order to make sure that our stakeholders could hold us accountable for what we're going to do. But in addition to working through that, she immediately said, I want us to focus on customer service, because fundamentally the IRS is the agency that most Americans in this country deal with. So we hired 5,000 people. And we also made a number of investments in technology that were going to be immediately felt. And what I'd say is that we've made a great deal of progress. We haven't reached perfection, but we're going to keep working. And the way you know that we've made that progress is that last year, when you look at the level of service in terms of phone calls being picked up, it was woefully poor, about under 15%. This year, we're above 85%. This year, we've answered 2 million more calls. We've served hundreds of thousands more people in person. One of the big places where we need to make investments, both for customer service but also for enforcement, is in technology. And one of the challenges that you heard about during the pandemic was the piles of paper that were building up at the IRS because during the pandemic, people were unable to work in person. Today, the IRS is scanning more of that paper than they've ever done before because of the investments we've made through the Inflation Reduction Act. So what I would say is that because of the money that's been invested through the Inflation Reduction Act, we're in a place where the American people can more easily deal with the IRS in the ways that you spoke about personally here. But what I also want to say is that the IRS is committed to continue to make investments so that you can deal with the IRS in an easier way going forward, so that by the time we're done with these investments, the IRS goes from an agency in which it was the technology infrastructure was built in the 1960s, before we had an ATM, before we had personal computers, to one that is a 21st century agency where it's going to be far more easy for you to pull that information online in the same way you can do from your bank or any company going forward.
So data, a data point is not an evidence proof, but I will say that I got a notice that said you'll get confirmation of this filing within 48 hours, and I got it in less than one. So that was a good day last night. 5,000 people that you brought on board, that's very frontline work. But one of the real priorities, I think, has to be the folks with the sophistication to do what are, in many cases, some of the most important audits. In many cases, the ones that really have fallen back, and that is the audits for the high net worth individuals, for companies, where your audit rates have been plummeting over the last decade, and yet where so much of the non-compliance has become more endemic. What are your plans to try to make a real dent in the tax gap?
So I think you're completely right, Sarah, that one of the challenges we've had is that because of the cutbacks in IRS funding, and it's important to remember that the IRS has as many employees today as they had in 1970. Think about how small our country was back in 1970. Audits for millionaires are down 70% over the course of the last decade. So a big part of this is that the Secretary has made a commitment that from a policy standpoint, she's asked the Commissioner and the IRS to make sure that we don't increase above historic levels audits for people under $400,000. The Commissioner has made very clear that he has no plans to increase audit rates for people under $400,000 because we know that the place where we need to do the most work is making sure that we increase audit rates for the top 1%, frankly, who, in our estimates, we're missing out on income in excess of $160 billion a year from those individuals. The challenge, of course, is that it takes a lot longer to audit someone who makes their money in various ways than to audit somebody who makes their money through a W-2. For the average taxpayer under $400,000, it takes about 5 hours to do an audit. For the average person who's in the top 1%, it takes an upwards of 250 hours to just start to do that audit. So we need to go out and hire, and that's what the Commissioner is focused on doing, individuals who are going from tax attorneys to accountants to data scientists, because ultimately what we're going to do here is we're going to use both technology, machine learning, and other methods to look at pass-throughs and other complicated ways in which people look to hide their income in order to try and close the tax gap. And it's important to recognize that ultimately, in a world where we are thinking about fiscal sustainability, one of the best ways to make sure that we're more fiscally sustainable going forward is not necessarily to change policy, but rather to enforce the laws on the books and to make sure that just like more than 85% of Americans and 90-something% of Americans who make W-2s, wealthy people also pay their fair share.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the role that technology plays because, again, not to make this about Sarah's taxes, but a year ago, the computer spit out a mistake that my accountant and I had made. And it was one, I hadn't made an estimated payment he said I had made. It's not a full audit, right? They're not people going through the boxes of cardboard papers in my house. But a computer made a correction that we had erred. That's the kind of getting the technology to answer the questions so that those people can do the hard and complicated and more sophisticated stuff. That's where the IRS hasn't been historically, and you're starting to make some progress on that.
And it's a place where we want to make a lot more progress because we think that and when you look at the plan, the strategic operating plan, one of the key pillars is helping people get it right. Because what we find is that for most people, especially people who earn income through a W-2, they're not trying to evade taxes. They can't because we see how much money they make. Sometimes they'll make simple math errors, and the more the IRS can help you fix those errors on the front end, it's better for you. But it's also better for us because then we can dedicate more of our resources towards the people who are actually trying to avoid paying taxes. So a big focus of the IRS plan, in addition to customer service and to enforcement, is going to be trying to make sure that we're doing everything we can to help people get it right in order to help them pay the taxes they owe, but also for small businesses and for individuals to make sure that they get the tax credits and incentives that they're also owed, because those are fundamentally important to our economic policy as well.
So when the Republicans took over the House, their first issue agenda item that they laid out was to try to repeal some of the Inflation Reduction Act investment in the IRS. And obviously that doesn't create a conducive environment for you for recruiting and for trying to build these technology infrastructures. So what's your strategy to try to both make progress on this, but also to try to respond to those kinds of criticisms of the decision?
And I just want to make clear what I think everybody is seeing this filing season. The money that we got through the Inflation Reduction Act is the critical piece that's made it easier for you to file your taxes this year, that's made it easier for people to get their phone calls answered by the IRS. And if Republicans took away that money, they would make it harder for everyday Americans to get the information they need from the IRS. But on the second part of this is that it would also mean that people who are trying to cheat the IRS, tax cheats, especially wealthy people who are trying to avoid taxes, would be better positioned to do that going forward. And ultimately, in a world where a number of members are talking about the importance of fiscal sustainability, neutral arbiters like yourself and also the CBO have made very clear that what this money, this $80 billion does, is it actually helps us bring down our debt deficit. And my view is that the neutral arbiters are being very conservative in the amount of money that you think that we're going to be able to bring in to reduce our deficits through the IRS, because the only thing you actually count are the people that we're hiring. Fundamentally, the investments we're making in technology, the investments we're making in helping people get it right are going to mean that voluntary compliance rates also go up, which mean that we're going to make even more revenue. Our estimate's somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 billion. I think that when you look past the first 10 years, you're going to see that that grows exponentially, and it is one of the things that will have the greatest impacts in us being able to bring down our debts and deficits over time.
So one of the things that we've all been talking about in every dimension of the society, and you actually, I believe, lead the Treasury Department's efforts on thinking about the impact that your department can have on closing equity gaps. One of the key questions is, are there differential audit rates for wealthy individuals, for low-income individuals, for rural, So how are you thinking about this question of looking at not only audit, but compliance rates differentiated by population, and sort of sharing with the public, and then will that affect behavior?
So to your question, we do know the audit rates for people based on wealth are different. And the big driver of that has been the lack of resources for the IRS.
And be transparent about which way it's different.
Yeah, and the reality is that it's easier to audit the taxes of somebody who just earns a W-2 than it is to audit a millionaire's taxes. And the IRS has focused its resources in ways that, based on the resources that it has. So the Inflation Reduction Act is going to put us in a position where we can actually do a better job of auditing the places where we think that there is income that is hiding from the American people. And this is fundamentally about fairness. And it is only fair that somebody who is earning millions of dollars and doing it through passive ways is required to pay their taxes in the same way that a nurse, a fireman, a laborer is required to do so. And that it's also important that we look to make sure that on all kinds of different ways that we have this fairness, including when it comes to discrimination against race. As you know, the IRS doesn't collect racial information on the 1040 or any of its forms, but it's important that we use the indicators that we can look at and say, are there things that we see in our policy that mean that right now tax policy is not being administered in a fair way? The commissioner has made a commitment that within the first 60 days of being in office, he's going to provide information to Congress. The secretary and I have made very clear that our goal is to make sure that in implementing the SOP, the strategic operating plan, that we do it in a way that adheres to the basic principles of fairness, in which we ensure that those people who are the most likely to be hiding revenue are the ones that we look to. And that's why she has both made the commitment around 400K that she's made, but also the ways in which we're thinking about enforcement more generally, and also the idea of helping those people who make under 400K try and get it right. It's all based on the idea that ultimately what we want in this country is a tax system that promotes fairness. That anyone who wants to pay their taxes, we want to help them do that. And for those people who, especially those on the high end who are attempting to avoid taxation, we're going to use the enforcement resources of the IRS to go after them, because it is fair to require them to pay for the services that help fund our country, but it is also critical to making sure that we have a fiscal sustainable outlook.
So we have a question here from someone, and it's really about the collecting information to find out about who's complying through the international system. What are you able to do, and are these resources going to support efforts to try to collect information from many of the countries that we think of as tax havens?
Yeah, and I think that I was at Treasury when FATCA was put into place, which provided us with the opportunity to receive information from a number of our allies and partners abroad about account holdings by Americans who are attempting to hide their wealth abroad. And these resources are going to help us not only take in that information, because as you know, wealthy individuals have numbers of accounts, have information that is hidden in various ways. But the technological investments will allow us to not only have to do the painstaking work of having individuals go through this paper on their own, but will allow us to use things like machine learning to be able to look at this information to see what kind of schemes are being used to try and hide wealth going forward. So these resources are going to not only improve our efforts to build up things that we do here domestically, but to help us take the international information that we're seeing to better assess how the wealthy are potentially trying to hide financial information abroad.
So you're in a room full of people who study the tax system, and probably, I suspect, some of our friends online who are watching as well. So two questions. At the heart, what they really are both about is what can others do? What are some of the questions that you have that the analytical power of us and many of our other institutions can be deployed against? And in particular, obviously, you're celebrating a plan to do a lot of good. What are you worried about?
I think the most important thing that we could ask for researchers to do is to come up with models that allow us to take to account for the other ways in which these investments are going to help us bring in revenue. Right now, the models that we have are fairly rudimentary. They look at the number of individuals who are bringing in, who are focused on a specific task, and then they provide an ROI based on that. My view, based on both what we've seen internationally and the international comparators, is that a number of the things that we are doing, like helping people get it right, improving customer service, will help improve voluntary compliance, and there will be a deterrent effect that will come from some of the enforcement work that we're doing. But we don't have successful models that help us do that. So the more work that can be done there, I think that will help us do our work going forward in ways that will be quite impactful to helping to understand how the IRS can contribute to bringing down our deficit over time.
So I am an average American who absorbs information from a lot of sources, and I hear told that somehow the IRS agent is sort of the boogeyman. It is the image that we all feel that someone, and when you are, I'll Sarah's story one more time, when you write in that check one time a year, and if you didn't withhold enough, that's a big gulp moment for anybody, no matter what their resources are. And how do you help explain to that person how they should be, how do we think about the IRS and the role of our tax system, and what are the opportunities that we have to sort of use technology perhaps to change people's experience so that, miserable moment on April 15th of writing the oopsie check isn't so challenging?
So I think that one of the two things we're trying to do is, one, make very clear to the American people as you go and file your taxes that we want to help you get it right the first time, because in addition to the fear of like writing a check and a number, and if you owe money, is making sure that you get it right, because you don't want on the back end to be in a position where all of a sudden you have an audit because you've made a simple math error. And what we're saying is that given the resources that Congress has now provided to us, not only are we going to be able to answer your phone call, but we're also going to be in a position to help you get it right by improving technology so that you can pull the information you need online. And it's not as easy as it should be, but a year ago we were in a position where we were scanning very few documents. Today we're scanning hundreds of thousands of documents, and within a year we're hoping that 72 of the most common forms that people use will be able to be scanned. What does that mean? That means that we'll be able to take them in very quickly, and then in the same way that we told you in the past it would take you 48 hours to get information, it won't even take an hour. It should take minutes for us to be able to come back to you. So we're trying to improve services dramatically so it's easier for you to file your taxes with the IRS. But filing taxes isn't only about how much money you owe, but if you're a small business owner in this country and you are trying to build up your local community and build your business, you're likely also eligible for tax credits. For everything from energy-related tax credits that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act. And we want to make sure that you have the information to be able to get those tax credits. Maybe it's the earned income tax credit if you're somebody who's earning the right level of income, but a big goal for the IRS is ensuring that you're in a position where we're helping you think through not only how you get your filing of taxes right, but you get the information you need to be able to claim the credits that you deserve. And on the other end, because we know that the vast majority of Americans want to file their taxes on time and to contribute, we also know that there are those people, generally people who make large amounts of money above $400,000, who are going through active steps to try and hide that income from the IRS in order to reduce the taxes they pay. And we want to ensure that we're building a system that's fair by hiring people who will be able to audit those individuals going forward. Auditing their taxes is hard because they have thousands and thousands of pages of to go through. And by hiring these new professionals, we're going to be in a position to better ensure that the tax code is fair, that we're able to produce the kind of revenues that will be used to do everything from building roads to investing in our schools and to providing for our troops. But to do that, we have to make these long-term investments in the IRS.
Well, thank you, Deputy Secretary, for being here and for the work of the agency on behalf of the American people. It has been a real pleasure to have you, and it is now my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Howard Gleckman, who is a senior fellow at TPC, who's speaking with another of those IRS commissioners, former Commissioner Rossotti, who held that position from 1997 to 2002, to hear their reflections on this. Howard, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for a very interesting conversation with Mr. Adeyemo. I'm Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at the Tax Policy Center, and as Sarah said, I'm here with Charles Rossotti, who was IRS Commissioner from 1997 to 2002, an experience he wrote about in his book, Many Unhappy Returns. Before leading the IRS, Mr. Rossotti was co-founder of the consulting and business systems integration firm American Management Systems. He currently is a senior advisor to the Carlyle Group. And along with several other former commissioners, he's been a strong advocate for additional IRS funding. So, Charles, let's start with an overall question. What did Treasury get right about this plan?
Well, let me say the way I think about this plan is what Eisenhower said about planning, an invasion, which is planning is essential and plans are, for the most part, worthless. And what I think he really meant, and what I interpret that is the act of planning, setting forth your goals, your objectives, your directions is absolutely essential in order to provide guidance. But the details beyond those that are the initial actions that you're going to take are, going to change. They need to change as you get experience. And that makes sense. And that's the way I think about this plan. So what are the key things? I think that the goals and objectives and general direction that are incorporated in this plan are outstanding, and I believe they will stand the test of time. And Secretary Adeyemo, outlined some of those with respect to improving service as well as the tax gap. And there are also many worthwhile projects that are identified that move in the correct direction. So that's all great. But I also believe that rigorous priorities are going to have to be applied to which of these things can actually get done over the period of time, because there isn't enough time or money, by the way, to do all this in the timeframes available. And in addition to that, I think the other big point, as the Secretary also mentioned, is that meeting these goals is very much dependent not just on money, but on using technology to improve the way the service works. That's embedded in all the goals. And frankly, if you look at that objective and compare it to the funding, the allocation for technology is going to have to be changed. It's going to have to be adjusted because there's an under allocation to technology. So I think the direction is good. The specific goals are good. The projects that are identified are all good. Many of the details, just like Eisenhower said, are going to have to be, revised as we get more experience. And final point is that, remember, this plan was also developed before Commissioner Wartell was even in office. In fact, I understand he was not even part of it until he got in. So that's also very important because don't forget, he's the one that's going to be accountable for delivering on all this. So bottom line, it's a very strong statement of direction. It identifies very well thought through actions on especially the service goals. But many details are going to have to be worked out. And I think the funding allocation is going to have to be revised in some fairly significant ways.
So that said, is there anything that you think they got wrong or that they left out that they should have included in this plan?
No, not that there's anything left out. I would say that, in fact, there's more here than you can really digest. As I read it, there's 42 key initiatives and 192 projects. That's a lot, and most of them are worthwhile. I don't see anything wrong. I will say that the service-oriented projects that are identified, particularly in the first year or two, are very specific and very well thought through. And some of them are already being shown as a self-service, more communication electronically with taxpayers, more scanning of documents, all very, very well good. Even that, there's more than they can do, in the first 2 years, I believe. But it's all in the right direction. I think on the what they call enforcement side, but I would call it compliance, they do identify the need for a strategic shift towards more use of data and technology. And of course, they do, I think, also identify at a very broad level some of the key areas where non-compliance is the most serious. And I agree with that. Our research, which my team has done a little bit independently, has also verified that. But on the enforcement and compliance side, the definition of how they're going to do that is more vague, frankly. And I think they need to spend a lot more time developing a compliance strategy that is more fine-grained than they have so far before they really start to ramp up a lot of auditing. Actually, I think my advice would be to go very slow on ramping up staffing on the enforcement side until they've really figured out how they're going to use, as they say they want to, data and technology to make that process more efficient. Otherwise, they'll get a lot of unproductive audits, and that's not going to be useful.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this. It's interesting. They anticipate hiring 20,000 new employees in 2 years. And that to me seems very ambitious, especially since many of them are CPAs and data scientists, which are occupations where demand for the private sector is high. Yeah. So is a fast track like that realistic?
Well, I don't know if it's realistic. I tend to doubt it from a purely HR standpoint, because even they identify in their HR that that's even dependent on technology, in giving the people the right tools. So I would say that if I were doing it, I would slow that down considerably. Definitely, you have to, show some progress on building the staff because it takes time, and you do need to show some audits, if nothing else, just to get more experience and data, because there's so light coverage right now in some of the upper brackets, some of the key areas, that you just need to do some just to get information and get experience. But I think that if I were to say the 2 areas that need to be revised, I would say slow down the hiring on the enforcement side. Not do zero, but slow it down and focus on having a smaller cadre of very experienced people and work on the strategy for compliance, using, as they say they want to, more data and analytics, which depends on the technology. And that will require a greater allocation of funding to technology than they have in this plan, because it's very minimal as it's defined now.
So in fairness to the Treasury and the IRS, this plan doesn't really obsess about headcounts, but the political debate does.
Yes.
And it is interesting. Do you think that the debate in Congress is focused too much on the number of new hires and not enough on technology?
Yes. Yes, but I think that there's 2 reasons for that. One, and they're opposite reasons. One, and this is where I think some education, let's say broadly, is going to have to be done. One is that, as Secretary Adeyemo alluded to in his last comment, the models that are used by CBO, and frankly, I would say even the Tax Policy Center in some cases, are really just overly simple. They're just basically, how many revenue agents do you have and how much does a revenue agent produce? And the answer is not very much. And if that's what you're going to do, you're going to have a large amount of resources expended with very little return. The only real returns come from using technology to identify, not only returns, but very specific kinds of issues, using things like, there's $18 trillion worth of income reported on various kinds of information reports, including like K1s. Hardly any of it is used in technology. So I mean, that makes no sense at all. That's the place that you have to invest. That takes some time. So hiring a lot of revenue agents just because it seems like you can apply a multiple of, so many dollars per agent is driven by, rudimentary, and I would say, not that it's badly intentioned, but that's the only models that they have. You have to get out from under that, because otherwise you don't do the right thing. On the other side, on the political side, you've seen the 87,000 armed agents. Well, I can tell you, I've made my own calculation of how many, if they did it, I wouldn't recommend that they do this, but if they just used all the money that's allocated under enforcement in the IRA and use that proportionately to just you hiring, even if they did that, even after 10 years, they'd only have about the same number of revenue agents that I had when I was commissioner in 97. So they're not going to flood the zone with revenue agents, even if they did it, and it wouldn't make any sense to do it. So I think this is a place that really the whole idea has to be rethought a bit. I mean, they had the right general idea, but the need to, just show how many dollars per employee you get is driven the thing in the wrong direction. And I agree with the secretary. I think that the places like the Tax Policy Center, it's hard to do, but I think doing some more work, I mean, research is really important in this area of, research in order to identify techniques, in order to identify where the real non-compliance is, how you can use the data that's already there. These are the things that are going to have to be done if we really want to have an efficient increase in compliance in the places where it's not there now. It's not going to be done by flooding the zone with revenue agents at all.
So I hope that all our prospective funders out there just heard Mr. Rossotti about the importance of research. Let me ask you about this issue of technology, and you're in an interesting situation because government procurement both from the vendor side and the government side. Yeah. Why does it take so long for the IRS to procure and install new systems? What's the problem?
Well, I think that one of the things that is not clearly understood well, and this plan makes us a beginning towards clarifying this point. But here's the key point. There's really two paths on technology. The path that people talk about all the time is we have these old tax processing system, the master file, it's written in COBOL, we have to replace that. Yes, we do. Guess what? And I've been in the technology business, not counting my term in this, for about 50 years. So I've dealt with a lot of clients. I'm still in it as an advisor. And I was on some large bank boards. Every large, business that I've been involved in, maybe not as old as the IRS, but they have old legacy systems. The banks have, the ones that do the deposit processing, many of them were written in the 70s and 80s. That hasn't stopped them from providing online service through web services and so forth. So think about the two paths. One path is, yes, as the GAO has said, the IRS does have to replace these older generation, what they call legacy tax processing systems, just because the risk of maintaining them and the cost of maintaining them and some of the constraints that they impose are very high. But there is no way to do that rapidly. Those are very high risk things. They have to be done gradually, even under the best of circumstances. In the IRS plan, they say they're going to retire the master file by 2028. That would be quite an achievement, frankly, if they could do that, okay, with new tech. But in the meantime, they themselves identify many number of projects on customer service, such as self-service accounts, such as scheduling appointments, such as communication. You don't need to replace the master files to do that. You have to manage some dependencies, and they've identified, yes, you do have to manage that. That has to be done carefully, but they have to go on two paths. So I think the right way to see it is the IRS needs to invest more in technology to do the very things they identify on their service and on their enforcement goals. And in the meantime, that's the front office, let's say. The back office is gradually replacing the old tax processing systems, because those have to be replaced in order to make the whole process more efficient. But they don't have to wait for that in order to do all the other improvements. And frankly, that's the way every large business in America works. The only difference at the IRS is it's a lot bigger. And, the systems that are legacy are in some cases older, but the basic path is not different.
Interesting. So we've been talking about money. but I think many observers believe that the IRS has more than money problems. They point to cultural issues, including middle management is highly resistant to change, a culture of secrecy, difficult union management relations, and low morale among the rank and file. How much can money fix this? And if it's not money, what is going to change this?
Well, any organization that is going to have to change is going to need money. And I can get into why this money is not going to fund everything that everybody wants, even though it seems like a big amount, because it's been in the hole. And that itself causes morale problems. But I would also say that it's absolutely true that money alone will not fix things. What you need is leadership and clear goals and commitments that can be communicated to the whole workforce and to the external on where you want to go. And I think that, you know, the most encouraging thing about this plan, which I can't overemphasize, is that the way that it portrays a vision of where the IRS should be on service, less clear on enforcement, but at least there's some movement in that direction, and also on the employee experience, is really good. And I think if it's not going to be achieved quickly, but it's a long-term plan. If the commissioner, and I believe he can gradually, you know, get the commitment of the workforce to move in that direction, which I think they can, and based on my own experience, because we made some movement in that direction, I think that, you know, progress will be made. Does that mean there'll never be any mistakes, that everybody will agree to it, that, you know, nobody's going to complain? And of course not. I mean, that never happens in any organization. But I think in terms of the workforce, my experience, and not only here, is that you can really think of the workforce as having, you know, broadly 3 kinds of thinkers. Okay. There are people at the IRS, there were when I was there, and I'm sure that will immediately look at this plan and say, man, that's why I'm here. I want to do that. You know, I want to provide that service. I want to get that technology, and I will be one of those leaders. I don't know what percentage that is. Maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 20%, but those people are there at every level. You're going to have another set at the other end that are naysayers, that are just, you know, have a negative attitude. They're never going to buy into it. And, you know, you just have to find a way to deal with those people. But the most people are wait and see. They're like, well, I would love this, but, you know, I'm kind of skeptical. I'll wait. You know, I've heard a lot of this before. I have to see. So as things gradually are shown to work and people are given tools, that they're given improvements, more and more people, you know, get on the bandwagon. It's just common sense. This is true at every organization I've been in. And it was equally true at the IRS. So the answer to your question is it only money? No. But I guarantee you, without money, it's not going to be solved. So you need money and you need leadership. And I think with Commissioner Werfel, I'm very optimistic that we have the latter.
Well, Charles, thank you very much. It's always good to talk to you, especially to hear your views about this. If everyone will be patient, we'll be just a minute while we set up for the next panel, which is going to be moderated by my TPC colleague, Janet Holzblatt. Thanks very much.
What was that great Clint Eastwood movie? The Rosens on one side, the Baxters on the other, and me in the middle. A fistful of dollars.
Okay, we're here. Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Holzblatt, and I'm a senior fellow at the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center. And I'm really excited about, well, the whole event, and I'm excited about this panel in particular. We have a really exciting group of people here. To my left, sometimes, is Nina Osen. She's the founder and executive director at the Center for Taxpayer Rights. Before that, she was the IRS National Taxpayer Advocate for 18 years. That's amazing that you could have the tenacity and patience for that. And before that, she founded and directed the first independent low-income taxpayer clinic in the entire United States. Next, wow, we're out of order here. Next to her is Pete Sepp, and he's the president of the National Taxpayer Union. Pete's first foray into IRS reform legislation occurred shortly after he started at the NTU in 1988. He worked on Taxpayer Bill of Rights, and he's continued to comment and advise on legislative efforts to transform the IRS system, of which there have been many efforts, I believe. Next to Pete is Natasha Sarin. She's an associate professor at Yale Law School with a secondary appointment at Yale School of Management. And before that, she served as the counselor to Secretary Yellen, and effectively she was an architect of the strategic operating plan. So it's going to be very exciting to hear Natasha's experience with that. And then further to the left is Rebecca Thompson. She's the vice president for strategic partnerships and network building at Prosperity Now. Both on the national and state levels, Rebecca has provided support for provision of tax assistance to low and middle income taxpayers. Rebecca is also a member of the IRS's Tax Advisory Council, which is a forum for IRS officials and the public to discuss a broad range of tax administration issues, and which produces an annual report with feedback, observations, and recommendations. So perhaps we'll get a preview today of what might be contained in that ultimate annual report. So we're going to see some overlap between my questions and Howard's. Independently, we came up with our questions. So obviously, we've asked the most important questions today. But my first question I want to go around is tell me what you feel is the most important feature of the plan, what is the weakest feature of the plan, and what's missing. And I'm going to start with Natasha to talk from the perspective of having been an architect. And we'll be particularly interested in what you might find as the weakest and missing. So Natasha, please.
Well, thanks to all of you for being here, and I'm just thrilled to be on this esteemed panel. I think that this is a really exciting moment for tax administration, and I hope all of you are as excited as I am. I think the strategic plan has in it many components which are truly revolutionary from the perspective of the IRS. And some of them we've already started to speak to this afternoon, but specifically the fact that the agency has made it such a priority to articulate how service is going to meaningfully be improved by this investment from the Inflation Reduction Act, I think is pretty powerful. And I think that's powerful not just from the perspective of the IRS, because, you know, every American taxpayer, every business deals with the agency each and every year. I actually think it's sort of really revolutionary from the perspective of those of us who've been involved in government or who care about good government writ large, because here's a chance to really show what the power of resourcing an agency is actually able to deliver. And the strategic plan speaks to some of this, but the IRS has already been able to do this in part this as early as this filing season. So you have a level of service that's meaningfully higher. You have digital interactions that you didn't have before these Inflation Reduction Act dollars came through. I think that matters a lot. And I think people are starting to tangibly feel this in ways that are impactful. I also think that it's you kind of have to read the strategic plan to really understand, but there's also a really important conceptual shift that's illustrated in the plan, which is that the way the IRS is thinking about compliance going forward is not just you comply with your taxes by making good on paying your taxes in full.
it's also, it's accuracy on both sides of the ledger. So as Deputy Secretary Adeyemo was speaking to, it's also that you get the benefits that you're entitled to, and that we invest and think about that as compliance in making sure that businesses and low-income people and the most vulnerable communities in this country who are entitled to services that Congress has decided to legislate through the tax code are actually receiving them. And that structurally is, for many of you who've been involved in the IRS, I'm sure former Commissioner Rossotti would articulate this as well, that's just like conceptually and structurally a very different way about thinking about the role of the tax administrator. And again, proof is in the pudding. We need to see how all of the plan is actually implemented against, but I think that that is just conceptually a pretty powerful thing that we should all be excited about. I think that there are real, and like, you know, it was inevitable that there were going to be deficiencies in the plan because the plan had to be put together to articulate a 10-year vision for the future of the IRS over the course of a 6-month period in the immediate aftermath of the Inflation Reduction Act being legislated. The two areas that I am most sort of focused on, and I'm trying to think about myself and my work as an academic going forward, one has to do with the point that Charles started to gesture at, which is with respect to prioritization. There is just so much good in this plan and so many exciting projects that the IRS wishes to undertake over the course of the next decade. But how you think about sequencing this work, what the first 12 to 18 months should look like for the agency, what are the highest return on investment types of activities, is a really structurally important question. Another pretty important question has to do with talent pipelines. The IRS of the future is not going to look like the IRS today. And it's not going to look like the IRS today because it'll be bigger. They have these resources. They can invest in areas of need, high-end compliance, global high net worth partnership, all of that. But it's also because the type of people who need to do that work are people that the IRS has not traditionally employed. They're data scientists. They're people with expertise in partnership law. Where you find that talent and how you articulate that the IRS is an exciting place to work for people who are interested in those types of questions is going to be like the greatest challenge that faces Commissioner Wartell over the course of the next few years. So I think there we saw the IRS acknowledging it needs to be an employer of choice. It needs to really recruit from pools of talent. But what that actually means in the constraints of the various hiring rules and pay rules in the federal government, that's hard. And we're going to have to see what the agency is able to articulate going forward. I think the piece that is like the piece that is missing and shouldn't have been in the strategic plan, but is animating many of us who think about these issues, is just like the political context in which we're operating. And there's a couple of dimensions to that. One is that you're already seeing, and we've already spoken about it today, a very long and sort of totally, inaccurate, but series of criticisms by critics of the IRS who are interested in rescinding these resources. In the short term, that's kind of irrelevant from the perspective of what Congress is actually going to be able to legislate. But there is a piece that's really quite relevant, which has to do with annual appropriations. And there you're already seeing that the IRS's capacity to kind of maintain steady state is being peeled back under the guise of, well, we gave them $80 billion, so why do they need as much money for IT investment or for enforcement going forward? What people need to understand is that meaningfully pushes against what the IRS is actually going to be able to deliver with these dollars. Because these dollars are about transforming the tax administrator into the 21st century. They're not about steady course going concern at the IRS. And one way to dwindle that capacity is actually, the transformative capacity is actually to dwindle the IRS's budget in steady state. Another piece of it that's really quite important politically is we just all have to realize that we're living through a pretty interesting political moment with respect to the IRS, where the next 12 to 18 months are actually hugely important for the agency. And we talk a lot about ROIs, like what's the ROI of different types of enforcement activities and all the like. I actually think the IRS has to be able to articulate what it is delivering for the American people as a result of these $80 billion in relatively short order. And that's a challenge because a lot of these investments are multi-year investments. It takes time to do some of the IT development that Charles was speaking to. But success here for the agency is going to rely on its ability to actually, in the short run, start to demonstrate what exactly it is doing and the ways in which the experience of everyday American people is meaningfully transformed by their efforts.
Rebecca, the best, the worst, the missing.
Thank you, Janet. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for hosting us on this wonderful and esteemed panel about the most important thing right now, about the $80 billion that the IRS is planning to spend over the next 10 years. I think I bring a different lens. I bring a lens from my work at Prosperity Now as a VITA volunteer, as a low to moderate income taxpayer advocate, and one who spends some weeks more hours than I would like to in meetings and working with the IRS. There are times and days that I think that I work for the IRS and not for Prosperity Now. And so I agree wholeheartedly, Natasha, that this funding is transformational. And over the years of spending hours, countless hours at the IRS, and hearing so many times the different projects and presenting them with thoughts and ideas and saying, you could do this, and they would say, yes, we could if we had the funding. And really hearing from staff what is needed in order to actually achieve a better IRS for our American people has been the funding. We are so excited that they have this opportunity. So for me, just from my experience, a couple of things strike me as being the most important in this plan. One is the on-demand customer service, the improvements that we've seen so far in customer service, that people can actually call and answer and actually get a response from the IRS. And so I think that is something that is transparent to the American public. It is essential to make sure that we have fair tax administration, is that people can get their questions answered when they need it. But case in point, as a VITA volunteer over the weekends, I volunteer on Saturdays, and when clients have issues, they can't call the IRS because IRS customer service is not open on Saturdays. And so people have to wait until Monday during regular business hours to actually get their questions answered. So I'm hopeful that through this, that people will actually be able to receive the customer service that they need and a time that they need it. Also very critical and important are the expanded digital services. And as Deputy Secretary Adeyemo spoke to earlier, the need to and the increases, the ability to scan those paper documents. We still have taxpayers who are insistent upon filing by paper, and they need to reply to the IRS through paper correspondence. And so it's really important that the IRS is able to actually convert that paper into a digital format as quickly as possible to speed up the processes, so that paper returns no longer take 4 to 6 months to actually process, but it's something that's much more reasonable and much more close to the time which those who electronically file can actually receive a response. I will say this will be the last one that's the most important, but it's notices that they can understand, that taxpayers will actually get letters from the IRS that are in plain English and that are not in IRS speak, so that they do not need an interpreter to be able to understand the notices from the IRS. I think it's critical to tax administration and fairness that people can actually understand the communications that they are receiving from our tax administrator. On the weakest parts of the plan, I would say was a section I read around promoting fairness and enforcement, and coming from a perspective that we believe in racial equity in the tax system and that tax administration should be equitable and fair. I found that portion of the plan to be lacking and very vague, and actually it seemed off in the distance that they actually are not planning to actually address the issues of racial equity in the tax system and in the administration, particularly with regard to their audit processes until fiscal year 24. And so it seems down the line recently, they've been made aware of the challenges and the disparities, racial disparities with their audit processes and systems. And so it did not seem very urgent for them to address it at the moment. And what's missing are, one, a comm strategy for the American taxpayer. And while, to your point, Natasha, it may not be necessary and may not be something to be included in this plan, I do think it's very important that they actually communicate out to the American taxpayer in a manner which they can understand how the IRS is improving and how the IRS is working for them and how their tax dollars are actually being used to improve tax administration for the American people. And also, along those lines, critical is a feedback loop. I did not see anywhere in this plan, well, it was mentioned vaguely around stakeholder engagement, but again, as a stakeholder with the IRS and a partner, there was not a lot of engagement that was offered and not a lot of opportunity for stakeholders to actually provide input into this plan. And so hopefully they will enlist the support and have a feedback loop so they can monitor how well they're doing.
Okay, Pete, your turn.
You know you're in trouble when one of your panelists brings a stack like this to a session. I
Oh,
promise.
it's even thicker than my pile.
Well, I promise I'll try to be brief, and thanks so much for this opportunity. I would like to focus on parts of the plan that have both virtues and the defects of their virtues. There's a 52% burn rate in taxpayer services funding envisioned in the first 2 years of the strategic operational plan. You can be encouraged by that fact, knowing that the IRS is sinking major resources into customer service from the very beginning of this plan. And you see it in spots, the encouraging signs, for example, an admission that the Independent Office of Appeals needs more staff if you're going to have enforcement being ramped up. You need to have off-ramps for folks who disagree with a tax assessment, even high-income folks. That's very important progress. The digitalization of notices, not just tax forms, is also vital. Did you see in reading the plan, they hope to ramp up from issuing 5 to 7 digitalized notices a year to as many as 500. Now, I don't know if they can make that goal, but it's a promising sign that the service recognizes there are many publics being served here, and one of the most important ones is the practitioner community. Communicate with them well, have a constant stream of guidance and notices, and you're going to solve a lot of problems with the millions of taxpayers that they're already serving. So that's an important recognition. I also see glimmers of the very important report, in our opinion, that was issued in early 2021. This is called the Taxpayer First Act Report to Congress. There, the IRS laid out, I think in better detail than the SOP, an excellent strategy for engaging and reimagining the taxpayer experience. And you can tell that in the SOP, a lot of the Taxpayer First Act report recommendations about a holistic taxpayer experience would be operationalized. So, important progress. What about the weakest features? Well, here's a defect of a virtue. When you have a burn rate for taxpayer services of over 52% in the first 2 years of the funding, you're creating cliffs, massive ones. And Nina Olson had an IRS budget expert, Ursula Gillis, on last week on a session where she was talking about these cliffs. The fact is, and you can read the warning on page 128 of the SOP, that they're going to run out of money probably in 4 years of this plan for anything that's taxpayer services related. Business systems modernization, if you look at the budget in brief, is actually being zeroed out, I believe, for fiscal 24. Those are the critical building blocks of any successful IRS transformation strategy. Set aside the enforcement strategies for now, and I think Commissioner Rossotti is making an important statement that he just did, that those things need to be thought out better, but in the here and now, we have major problems with cementing into place the gains that the IRS hopes to make in the next couple of years in taxpayer services and business systems modernization. And this would be a message I would take to fiscal conservatives and Republicans right now. Get out ahead of this. If you want an IRS that is transformed and you don't want a strategy that obsesses about wringing collection dollars out of taxpayers through expanded audits, focus on this problem right now. Try to confront and work with Democrats to find a way forward so that we don't squander all of this potential for progress. It's there. We need to work on it. Other weak features of the plan, well, that's probably, again, a function of these funding cliffs. You're going from 24% of the IRS funding mix now toward taxpayer services to just 14% 5 years from now. That's not going to be enough. We have to find a solution to it. What's critical but missing from the plan? Pretty much everything else. It's easy to say, okay, this is a fantastic comprehensive plan, but the IRS executive management is not going to be operating in a vacuum here. It's important to remember this $80 billion amount of money occurred through the reconciliation process, the worst possible way to try to initiate an agency transformation. You compare and contrast that, and we can do more of this later, with the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act. Began with a bipartisan commission, was developed through field hearings and hearings in Congress into a 184-page bill. This massive transformation began with 3 paragraphs in a piece of reconciliation legislation. It would be like saying to the Department of Defense, you know, we're going to boost your funding from $800 billion a year to $1.2 trillion. You can spend a little more than half of it on weapons, the rest on personnel and research, and there you have it. And the Secretary of Defense would say, well, we're going to at least come up with a strategic plan on how we're going to spend it. They deliver it to Congress and say, we're going to have a bigger Navy, more aircraft carriers, more planes, more tanks. We're going to staff up in the non-commissioned ranks. We're going to be able to fight 2.5 wars simultaneously. But that would never be the end of a discussion over the Department of Defense's transformation. Congress wouldn't say, thank you, generals, have fun shopping and get back to us in 10 years. No, this is going to have to involve genuine, serious oversight, not looking for more lowest learners or harpooning wealthy taxpayers. It's going to mean honest discussions about how to transform an agency that touches everyone's lives. Republicans in Congress have to be involved in that, and the IRS's strategies elsewhere, not just in the executive branch, but how it is pursuing cases in the courts has to be examined. Other off-ramps like alternative dispute resolution, which has been a pilot program in the IRS for years and needs ramping up. All of these things have to function together. And so if we take the view that this strategic operational plan is the thing that's going to transform the IRS, we have to think again. There are many, many more elements that need to fall into place.
And Nina, do you have anything to say, Nina?
So my focus has always been on taxpayer rights and how the IRS treats its taxpayers regardless of their compliance posture, because rights apply to both compliant and non-compliant taxpayers. And so that's what I bring to looking at the plan. I also have to say that over 18 years, I've seen an awful lot of IRS plans. And, you know, this one is just, it's not visionary, but it is laying out a lot of good things. What I think the most important feature of the plan is also the weakest feature of the plan, and it's also got whole elements that are missing from the plan, and that is the emphasis on early correction. And so I'll just go through each one, why I think that's really strong, why I think it's really weak, and what's missing that could maybe allay some of my fears. So I think it's really important, as everyone's spoken about here, you know, to identify errors up front. And that's not just because that will prevent taxpayers from making errors that the IRS thinks are errors, but also early give the taxpayer an opportunity to say to the IRS, I think you're wrong, you know, and you need to correct what you're saying to taxpayers. And again, over 18 years being inside the IRS, I saw many instances in the filing season and afterward where the IRS put out advice that was just generally wrong. They didn't think through how taxpayers' lives really were and how the law might apply to this set of facts as opposed to this most common set of facts, which creates issues that then have to be worked downstream in the most expensive arenas. So identifying issues up front errors up front is really important, and then equally important, which I was really heartened to hear in the plan and see how much was emphasized, was identifying opportunities for people to claim benefits, not just low-income persons claiming refundable credits, but also small business opportunities, et cetera. That's very much an interactive, you know, supportive approach to taxpayers, and it also is data-based because it means you have to look at their data, have, you know, some kind of systems and machine learning where you can look at a taxpayer's facts and say, you know, we think that you might be eligible for this. You might want to, before you file your return, take a look at this. Now that leads to where the weakest part of the return, the issue is what are the taxpayers' rights in this filing and upfront process where the IRS is looking at this return and saying, oh, you know, someone else claimed your child on a return. So right now what they say is you're not allowed to e-file. So everybody's saying, you know, paper is kryptonite. Well, the IRS is forcing people to claim their benefits to file on paper in that kryptonite way. If you ramp that up with all sorts of other things where the IRS is saying, you know, we think you're wrong here, what's the taxpayer's choice? Does the taxpayer then say, well, I think I'm right, but now I have to file on paper? They will not do that, most of them. They will just say, oh, okay, and therefore they will not agree with the IRS. They will disagree with the IRS, but they will be forced to e-file. If they want to e-file, they will be forced to accept the IRS's position, or they will be forced to do it on paper. So the weakest part of the plan is articulating what you're going to do in that upfront filing, you know, relationship where the IRS says, we think you're wrong. Can the taxpayer say, well, I think I'm right, and I'm going to continue to e-file? That's important. I would also maintain that legally, that return that the taxpayer is trying to file is actually under Beard v. United States, which is the law of the land, is actually a return. And so the IRS is refusing to accept an actual return from a taxpayer in electronic format, and I think the IRS has significant legal exposure on that. So that's the weakest part, and we need that figured out before it starts flipping all the switch on all of these things where it says you've got an error. You know, it's got to figure out how it protects the taxpayer rights there. And then what's missing from the plan is that discussion, how you're going to protect taxpayer rights in that way. But there's a larger piece, and I've spent a lot of time visiting with other tax administrations around the world this last year, both in the Netherlands and in Australia, where they have had major scandals with the tax administration about the use of data to identify error, fraud, etc. And in the Netherlands, it led to the complete resignation of their government. Their entire government stepped down because of a tax scandal in 2021. So there, I not only need to see, what the plans are, as Natasha was talking about, for, data scientists, computer engineers, mathematicians, but I need to see data ethicists. I need to see the IRS hiring people who are really thinking about whether this data is fit for purpose in the way it's being used, and what we don't have in that data. And of course, to Rebecca's point, what kind of historical biases are in that data, because the IRS has really imperfect data sets in that way. And I'll just end with that.
The example in Amsterdam and the Netherlands, is that the case where they have been using machine learning to identify who could claim a certain child benefit?
It was
and there was built-in implicit bias?
Yeah, it was a combination of things. There's a child care subsidy that's paid through the tax system. And, you used last year's income to alert, and then taxpayers had the obligation to update monthly. And there was a system that was built. There are actually two different scandals, but on the the child care subsidy, the system that was built was using income data that was not designed for the purpose that they were using it for, to detect fraud. And it basically, and then it was coupled with the agency's determination, that approach that it was all or nothing, that if you were inaccurate in one area, it meant that you were going to be inaccurate for the entire year and even going back 6 years. So it led to class actions, and ultimately the government had to pay out like 35,000 euro to each of the families affected. They're just, like I say, the government resigned, and it just has gone on. Just the other day, the GDPR Commission basically ruled that the other scandal, this database that was using tax data, among other data, to detect fraud, was a violation of the GDPR rules. On top of a court had held that it was a violation of the European Commission on Human Rights. So you can just see, and there are several things in there. They couldn't explain how the system worked, or they wouldn't explain it because it was enforcement. So you have a black box either way.
Yeah, that seemed to be an example of the downside of things like machine learning, where you need humans to be able to input the data, to analyze the data, so you can see those kinds of patterns emerge. I want to go back to this issue of the money, the allocation of the money, and particularly the money going for taxpayer services. First of all, I found it amazing that the administration got the full $80 billion it had asked for. I wonder what happened inside the Treasury Department building when they realized they got what they asked for. But you also got the amounts that you had allocated for each function. And so the $3.2 billion for taxpayer services actually came from inside Treasury and then got stamped by the Congress. And now, as Pete alluded to, the IRS is saying that in 4 years, that's all going to get used up. So Natasha, I'm going to put you on the spot and say, why $3.2 billion?
So I actually think we can learn something going forward for how we think about revenue from the allocation of the IRS resources. And what you notice, and what Pete already spoke to, the amount of funding that's in taxpayer service is about a year's worth of discretionary funding for the IRS and service. So it's $3.2 billion. The amount of money that's in the enforcement account is about $45.6 billion. That's about 8 times what is an annual discretionary budget for the IRS in the last few years. So, what explains that discrepancy? On the one hand, that discrepancy has to do with the fact that, as Deputy Secretary Adeyemo spoke to, there are just huge needs in enforcement, particularly enforcement against high-end sophisticated taxpayers, where the IRS's partnership audit rate is like essentially zero. It opens 7,500 partnership audits each year. It gets 4.5 million returns. That's an audit rate of zero. Its audit rates for multimillionaires has dropped out by 80%. There is a 1-for-1 decline in additional tax collection from those types of taxpayers as a result of that decline, twice as much as the decline, more than that, for EITC recipients, because those audits are just easier to do. They require fewer resources. So on the one hand, really huge needs in enforcement, really significant investment in enforcement. But as the strategic plan speaks to, there are really significant needs in taxpayer service. And that's not just traditional taxpayer service that the IRS has emphasized this filing season when they're hiring people to be at taxpayer assistance centers and help taxpayers in person, or hiring people to answer the phones. What they're trying to build is a 21st century tax administrator where you communicate with the IRS like you communicate with Bank of America. You can do everything on your phone, instantaneously, aided digitally, simultaneously. The IRS is able to have one look at a taxpayer and able to understand when they might be eligible for benefits that they're not claiming and alert them to that, and able to fully digitize the end of paper for the IRS. None of those piles of paper that you have in cafeterias or have had in cafeterias in the last few years. What they're looking to do is, from taxpayers may decide to file on paper, that's great from the taxpayer's perspective, but from the IRS's perspective, they move away entirely from the concept of doing things manually. That is like huge, and is going to require a huge investment in technology and service. So why do you see less funds than you need in service in the Inflation Reduction Act? The reason that you see less funds than you need in service in the Inflation Reduction Act, against the efforts of many who were pushing very hard for more dollars of service to be included both within the administration and in Congress, is because not a single one of those dollars scores in the traditional scorekeeping process. The only thing that you get credit for from the perspective of traditional scorekeepers is you get credit for dollars that you spend in the enforcement account. That means when CBO does its tally of it's going to raise some $100 billion plus over the course of the decade from investing in the IRS, they're not scoring this $80 billion of investment in the IRS. They're only scoring that $45.6 billion that was in the enforcement account. And that, as Deputy Secretary Adeyemo spoke to, is both inaccurate because it's an implicit assumption that any single dollar spent on service that helps a taxpayer get it right initially, that increases a voluntary compliance rate. That's left unscored. Any single dollar left on investing in an IT transformation that helps taxpayers file more simply, that is left unscored. And so from the administration's perspective and from legislators' perspective, every dollar that they spent on an account that wasn't enforcement was actually a net loser in the scorekeeping process. And so as we look forward, I think one of many people here do work on tax administration and tax administration types of issues. As we go forward, I actually think we need to think very specifically about the deficiencies in the way we analyze the impact of investments like the one that's just been made in the IRS, because they have real consequences, and the real consequences have to do with the distribution of these dollars.
Okay, so I have to say something in defense of CBO. As not only a former CBO employee, but a former Office of Tax Analysis at Treasury, but the methodology that CBO uses came from what Treasury had done. So, and that was based on evidence that was available. And I think going forward, it's something that we all have to look into, is how to account for the indirect effects of compliance, the deterrence effects, then next the taxpayer services. And that's really an area where we don't have enough research on. And so developing that academic research, developing that evidence is really going to help both the folks in the Office of Tax Analysis and CBO come up with estimates that reflect those, activities. But I just really hate CBO taking the heat on that. Nina has her hand up here.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this came up in our conversation last week with, on the IRS, budget, Ursula Gillis, the former IRS CFO, who worked at, OMB, and this sort of is a defense of, CBO in a way, said that, there are other agencies that actually do find a way to score service assistance outreach. And, that really alerted me to, like, we need to look at other agencies. How are they doing it? And there may be some methodology that we can apply that is already being fit into the budget of other agencies somewhere. And so somewhere we just, and I think this goes to a major criticism that I have of the IRS, that I've made since I was, at least since 2010, is that the IRS is completely enforcement minded and defines itself as an enforcement agency first and foremost. And until it changes its mission statement to say, one, that it is charged with administering, not enforcing the law, like it used to say back in in 2000 when they changed it, and then in the dead of night changed it from administering the law to enforcing the law, but also that it recognized that it has a mission, a dual mission of dispersing benefits as well as collecting revenue. Then the measures won't derive from that. It derives from the mission statement, how you measure things, and that goes to measuring taxpayer service.
Now Pete has his hands up.
Yeah.
You're a very polite group.
Well, I would just add that, yes, in addition to other federal agencies, state agencies have looked at this question too. It was Ernie Dronenberg from the Franchise Tax Board of California who determined that a 0.5% increase in voluntary compliance brought about by better notice making and the like from the state was increasing their collection by $400 million, which is twice as much as they could have ever gotten by doubling their audit rate of returns. And that's a heck of an equation.
Rebecca, you've had your ear to the ground more than perhaps anyone else on this panel with respect to what's going on in terms of the impact of the 5,000 new employees who were handled with taxpayer services. Are the folks, who are actually doing returns for low and middle income taxpayers, are they seeing benefits from the investment thus far?
I would say yes, we are seeing the benefits of the investments in the IRS. I think just the thing that I alluded to earlier, and I'm looking forward to more accessible customer service, just live in-person customer service. The IRS has also implemented chatbots, AI bots over the last year or so, which have actually proved to be instrumental. They are looking towards actually adding more features to their AI bots, and some that are authenticated features so people can actually call, get a bot, and actually authenticate themselves and find out, like, where's my return, where's my refund. I think just coming through the pandemic and still serving low to moderate income taxpayers, what we've realized is, like, the digital divide is real in our country, and the most underserved, the most marginalized communities in our country still don't have access to technology in the ways in which we would like to think that they do. So it is very important that the IRS continue to maintain, and I remember using this analogy when they several years ago in the early 2000s, that even though I can bank online, I can do all my business online, there's still a branch that I can go to and I can walk into and meet with the teller and meet with a customer service representative. I can still call and get the service that I need if I'm uncomfortable doing that online, or if there's something that I need to do in person. So it's really important that the IRS, while we are improving digital services and going all the way there, I think it's great for those who can, but that we are careful not to leave out those who continue to be, who are historically marginalized in our country and underserved. Because the fact of the matter is that 70% of Americans still are eligible to file for free. That means 70% of households in America make less than $73,000 a year. And so it's most likely that a large swath of that population will still need some other kind of services other than digital.
Okay, anyone else before we turn to enforcement?
I think I just want to say that it's really important to get your measures right about this, and you need to do this through surveys, not just customer satisfaction surveys, but really in-depth surveys. So, great, it's a great level of service on the phones. It's increased, we've talked a lot about it's not TIGTA, and I agree it's not really an accurate, it doesn't tell the full picture of how the taxpayer's experiencing reaching out to the IRS, but you really need to know whether the taxpayer got resolution to their issue with their first point of contact, or did they go online? Yeah, your online usage bumped up, but then they ended up having to go to the phones. They first went to the website, didn't get an answer, then did Q's and A's, didn't get an answer, went to the automated phone, didn't get an answer, now they finally got a human being, and they're really ticked that it took them that long, even if they finally get an answer. That's the sort of thing that you have to track.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about other types of research that can be done.
Yeah.
That
We
take
did that
out.
survey a
Yeah,
couple
I don't know
years
if a
ago.
survey is sufficient as to perhaps
Yeah.
more on the ground,
Yep,
some ethnographic research.
Yep.
I love that term.
yep, exactly.
Yeah.
And a couple of things about, and I know we're going to turn to enforcement, but like you only can measure what you measure in some sense. One challenge with respect to service, where I think the IRS starts to speak to it in the plan, but this is another area where there's more work to do, is the private sector actually has very good ways of measuring what they call customer satisfaction in a much more holistic way than a level of service number that frankly is driven a lot by phone demand, right? So I think the IRS needs to be very creative internally, and those of us who are focused on this externally need to be really thoughtful about the ways in which we provide direction and opportunities for course correction based on a more holistic view. The same thing is true, for what it's worth, with respect to enforcement, where the part of the tax gap that the IRS is best at measuring comes from individual random audits that it does. And so the corporate tax gap and the partnership tax gap, even today, steady state, where you have a $600 billion annual tax gap, is likely massively underrepresented. And so as we start to make progress and do many more partnership audits, we're all going to have to be really thoughtful about how to perceive that baseline. Because what you might very well see is, as you start going after more of these challenging types of taxpayers, you're going to see your tax gap as measured rise, not fall. And that's going to be an issue of interpretation for all of us as we think about the power of these investments going forward.
That's a good, I'm sorry. That's a good segue to a couple questions we've gotten from the audience, which are related. Just generally, one question, generally we've gotten one comment that the discussions focus mainly on individuals thus far. And so we have two related questions about, one, what can business taxpayers expect from the plan besides increased enforcement? And related to that is, there's a lot of the plan about what's happening with the IRS staff per se, but not much in terms of what's going to happen with Office of Chief Counsel and the lawyers at Treasury who work on regulations. What do you see in the plan? What can we see constructively from the plan with respect to what will be happening with business taxpayers and the needs within the IRS and Treasury lawyers and CPAs and the like to be able to deal with that community? And the answer is, we need to think about this some more.
Well, a lot goes back, first of all, I think, to data security. As Nina was pointing out, it brought down a government in Europe, but of course, there is no equivalent type of privacy protection for citizens from their government in the United States. Not most of the national privacy frameworks that are being advanced in Congress don't even hold government to the same standard as the private sector. And I think it was Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration just came out with a report. The IRS failed on 17 of 20 standard core data security metrics. So where are they going to house this data on corporations? How are they going to safeguard it? What are they going to do differently in the area when you consider that no change recommendations in Form 1120 audits are like 50%. With partnerships, it's 80 to 90. What else do we expect to find there? And how are they thinking through things like, again, bringing in the practitioner community early and trying to resolve differences in law before they hit the audit side? 40% of regulations issued by the IRS are either not the subject of an Administrative Procedure Act comment period, or they make the regs final before they've even read all of the public comments. You have other agencies like Federal Housing Finance Agency that is just a model for taking complex issues, getting public feedback, and they do side-by-side saying, here's what the rule was before we got the public feedback, here's what it is now, and here are the changes that people suggested to us that make sense. IRS doesn't do that, and that's not creating a climate of trust.
So, I would, oh, go ahead. Go ahead, you go first. Well, thank you. I would first say you need a chief counsel nominated and approved, and someone that has experience on the receiving and working with regulations that have not had sufficient, review of the notice and comment. I also think this does go to the data security point. Is, the IRS has all of this FATCA data, and it doesn't have a management system to use that data well. And both GAO and TIGTA have written reports about how it's not using that data. And some of it is because it's coming in a format that it can't use. Some of it is because, lo and behold, you find the information is maybe not as helpful as everyone built into that statute or expected from that statute. But others is, you don't have the skills in-house to think about how you could use that data well and how it could be used with other data. And again, that goes to you really need to know the problems of your data before you start applying it, which I think also really goes to Charles's point about go slow on this. Bring in your cadre of experts. And, if you can get critical pay authority so that you can pay them something, that brings them in from the private sector so that you can really plan and experiment and search about this data, then you can start hiring people to, operationalize the data. And one other thing, you mentioned FHA, I've always thought critical pay is not enough to bring in some of this talent. When you look at everybody talks about the IRS as being the largest financial institution around or whatever, but if you look at the bank overseers, if you look at the banking agencies, they're not on GS scale. Why is it that the IRS, at least in some of its upper echelons, is on GS scale, so that you couldn't set salaries that would bring in the people that you need to give us the 21st century tax administration that we're all saying we want? And I think that's something, it's over and above, critical pay, but it's really trying to look at what are the skills you need to bring about this transformation and then making it possible to hire those people.
Maybe just one or two quick points. One is I wouldn't take too much away from the no change rates that you've seen over the course of the last few years for large corporate taxpayers and partnerships. And it's actually a point that Janet has made, but the reality is that too is a function of resource constraints. What you're experiencing is an IRS that, in the case of one very famous former president, managed to marshal one revenue agent to deal with 500 partnership and pass-through structures. That is not an IRS that's had the tools that it's needed to really do this work, and the no change rate is really meaningfully a function of that. I do think that in part because of the interests of this group, we've been talking a lot about individual taxpayers and what your experience is going to be when you can deal with the IRS like you deal with your bank on your phone. I think with respect to business taxpayers, something that's really important to understand is that so much of the Inflation Reduction Act outside of these $80 billion all of the energy tax incentives are flowing through the IRS, being implemented by the IRS, with regulations being written by the IRS and Treasury. And so there's both a need to invest very seriously in top talent to deal with a really complicated and novel way of encouraging our transition to green technologies. But there's also a real opportunity. We talked a little bit about stakeholder engagement. There's a real opportunity to reach out to different classes of taxpayers who the IRS wouldn't have normally interacted with historically in this same way, and ask them what type of clarity would be valuable. How should we do this work? How should we try and structure the information that we're giving you? And all of this is happening on very tight timelines, and it's all happening simultaneously. So it's an area of great challenge, again, to think about prioritization going forward, but it's also an area of great opportunity where the IRS can really be an engine of change in our economy in a really impactful way.
So one question that's come in from another question that's coming in the audience is about dollars for marketing to people so that they would be willing to, say, have an app, an IRS app on their phone. Rebecca, do you think something like that would be helpful? I mean, the IRS has talked about we're going to give taxpayers any option they want to contact us. Is the phone a better vehicle for contact than the computer, than going into person? What do you?
I think that they have an app.
Yeah. Oh, they do?
They do have an app. It's the IRS To Go app.
IRS To Go. Just like when you try to order your food to go.
There are a lot of opportunities for improvement with the app. It is very limited in its functionality, but as long as they have the app, that gives us a great starting point. And that folks, I have encouraged people to use the app, particularly when they have a balance due. It makes it really easy to engage with the IRS and pay your balance due from your phone. But there's a lot of opportunity there to actually grow and expand and build upon that app so that it is more functional for the average taxpayer. Yeah.
You know, I was in Australia 10 days ago, and I met with the second commissioner there. Had a long conversation with him, and first thing I asked him was, or one of the things I asked him was, if you had a chance to tell Danny Werfel anything, what would you tell him? And he said, get an app. And what he meant by that, and then he proceeded to show me what he can do with the app that Australia Tax Office has. So he did show me his account, so I got to see how much the second commissioner is paid, and a few other things. But it is comprehensive. And then I asked him, well, I mean, the IRS has these online accounts, and, it's got, what, a 30% pass rate, people trying to. So everybody apparently can sign on. It's an all-government account that then feeds into different agencies in Australia. And I said, you have security issues too. Why are you able to have people sign on to this? And he said, well, what's the alternative? Like, yeah, you're worried about security for your app, but your alternative is to send a piece of paper in an envelope through the mail with ATO address on it. Is that secure? I just sort of sat there thinking, oh my God, that's a paradigm shift. And I just have to close this comment with, I was in London in December, and we were staying in a flat, and we came down the stairs one morning, and there on top of the radiator was an envelope for one of the tenants in the building from the IRS. And it sat there on top of that radiator for 2 days. I was about to go upstairs and knock on that person's door and say, if you have a problem, you could talk to me about it. But then the envelope disappeared. Now, I don't know whether someone took it or the person it was intended to, but I'm just saying, think about the security of that as opposed to trying to figure out your system so that more people can get into the app and use it.
Yeah, I saw an envelope like that in my building, but it was to somebody who'd already moved. Not only escaping us, but the IRS too.
If I can add to that as well, because the app, yes, needs to be improved, but even the online accounts, which, I'm looking forward to seeing some improvement in the online accounts because it's challenging and difficult to navigate. And they're not always accurate and up to date. There's no instructions to do if you get on that account and the information's not right. Where do you go? who do you call and get it straightened, because it's the IRS and you presumably the information would be correct.
Right.
So there's a lot of opportunity over the next 10 years.
$400,000, historic levels. So going back to earlier comments or earlier things, the Treasury Secretary has directed the IRS to not to use the additional funds to increase audits on individuals with income below $400,000 beyond historic levels. Now, the $400,000 is consistent with other thresholds that were set in President Biden's original plans, $400,000 for taxation of various forms of increases in taxation. The historic levels and the $400,000 threshold views here and how that's going to be implemented. Has Treasury and the administration boxed the IRS into a constraint that's going to be difficult to follow through on?
I'll start.
Okay, Pete.
Look to the courts. I mean, can you imagine a situation where you have two cases in two different districts with the same relative sets of facts and circumstances? The IRS designates one case for litigation, shutting off a lot of avenues for appeal for the taxpayer. One taxpayer there makes $450,000. What do you do when you have the same case in a different district, designating it for litigation, and the taxpayer's at $300 or $250? The IRS's legal team can't really differentiate. I mean, they're actually required through, I guess, what you call the doctrine of non-acquiescence to pursue these cases the same way. I don't see how you practically get around that very easily.
I mean, I think a couple of things are just worth highlighting. I think practically, one way that you deal with cases like you've just illustrated, Pete, is by thinking about how this $400,000 threshold is actually going to be operationalized in practice. And important when I was in the administration, there was a lot of focus on this particular provision, especially as the Inflation Reduction Act was nearing passage. And an important thing to understand is that the way I've always thought about this provision, for what it's worth, is that what's relevant from the IRS's perspective is obviously not the income that you report on your tax return. It's some measure that we have to construct of what a taxpayer's actual or true income is, or what we suspect a taxpayer's actual or true income is as we make enforcement decisions. And I think there are obviously going to be important threshold questions, and there's like $400,000, does that create a line, and do you worry when you're over the line or under the line? But practically, I think the impact of the Secretary's directive is actually to really clearly and transparently articulate what these additional resources are meant to support. And these additional resources are meant to support enforcement activities in areas where the IRS has kind of been in this David v. Goliath type of battle with complex taxpayers and global high net worth individuals who have every resource to marshal against defending really questionable tax positions that are at the border between avoidance and evasion. And because we haven't actually had, the IRS hasn't actually had any tools to pursue that type of evasion, that's basically a sign to would-be evaders that there is no tax cop on this beat. And in the same way as if you didn't have speeding cameras on traffic lights, you incentivize more malfeasance by the lack of a real IRS presence. And so what this directive is about and what this focus is about is really about making clear that we know that there are areas where there is a lot of work to do. And this goes back to my initial point on prioritization. The IRS has so much to do that it can't do everything all at once. So what it needs to spend these next few years doing is picking a few areas in service and enforcement where it's going to be able to demonstrate progress. And one of those areas, I hope, and I the plan very clearly articulates that that is the intent, is with respect to high-end and complex evasion, where today they have no capacity really to do that type of work.
Yeah, Rebecca.
If I could add, I would actually like to see more specificity there, because again, 70% of American households make less than $73,000. So, and there needs to be additional specificity so that the IRS does not continue and that we are not reinforcing this pattern that they have of auditing low-income filers, low to moderate income filers, because those are the easy returns. It's easiest to do, and so I think there needs to be something additional there, some additional protections beyond just the $400,000 that actually protects the vast majority of American households, and particularly those who may be eligible for the earned income credit from actual potential audits at the same rates. And also, which historical levels are we talking about?
What is history? Particularly since the last, is it 2018 where audit rates are, 2018 returns where audit rates have really gone down, possibly because those were returns being audited during the pandemic. Are we going back to 2010? Are we going back to 1998? We've only got about 7 minutes left, and I want to close by going back around the panel. And this time, this is going to be 2 questions. Originally, it was going to be one question, but we've only got 7, which is how do we measure success? And how do we measure success of this program, as opposed to the success of this panel, but how do we measure success of the strategic operating plan? And what are the risks of not achieving? What are the risks that might happen that would prevent that success from happening? So Rebecca, and then straight across the panel, the row here.
Well, I think the IRS has defined success in a number of ways in the plan. And so I would first say let's measure by whether or not they think that they're successful. And then the challenge with not being successful, particularly, I think, with not being able to effectively communicate with taxpayers over the course of the next year about the successes that they are achieving. I think they need to tackle some low-hanging fruit and be loud about it and make sure everybody knows how well they're doing, because the challenge is that, they're going to face appropriations challenges over the next couple of years and actually eroding this $80 billion investment and having to use that to support their general operations.
Natasha, success risks.
So with respect to success, I will use this as an opportunity to just highlight some forthcoming work that Mark Mazur and I are doing with respect to thinking about the revenue consequences of investing in the tax gap. And what this and we'll have in great detail an explanation of how we actually get to these numbers. But what this graph illustrates to all of you, I hope, is that by the end of 2 decades, if we meaningfully make an attempt to capture some of the revenue that today is owed to the fisc but not being collected, we're going to have about $200 billion more annually in tax collections as a result of this work. That's $200 billion more to support investments in our children, investments in our climate, and to reduce our deficits. Today, the tax gap is 50% of the federal deficit. The tax gap by itself, 50%. So there is a lot of room for meaningful improvement. What I think we should measure the IRS against with respect to both service and enforcement is the ways in which it starts to make progress towards these goals. And that's going to require not just pointing at the ways in which invariably with a project, a transformational effort of this size, there are going to be things that don't work. There is going to be a need for course correction. But we also, and particularly this community of experts, can do a lot of good by helping to articulate and making clear those things that the IRS is trying and doing differently that are actually working. I think my real worry and nervousness about the next several years comes from something Rebecca actually spoke to, which is the importance of the IRS being able to articulate, strategically communicate to taxpayers, to Congress, all the good that these $80 billion are doing. And that's like a new muscle for the IRS. And frankly, if they start to spend big chunks of this $80 billion on what they will be accused of as like a PR or a branding effort, that will be problematic for them politically. So what they need to think about internally is how to be creative about the ways in which they tell their story. And what all of us need to think about is how to help lift up the ways in which the IRS is meaningfully improving the lives of the American taxpayer, and also the ways in which it has a ways to go.
Okay, Pete and Nina, I'm going to have to limit you each to a minute. I know, but it's been such a great panel. So Pete.
To measure success, you need to measure failure and learn from it. That's what's important here. The IRS needs to do a better job soliciting public feedback. There will be public confidence in the service if they know they can make comments on rulemakings and have them listened to. They will know that GAO's 230 unimplemented recommendations for IRS are actually being taken seriously. The excuse has always been, or at least in about half of them, we don't have the resources. Now they do. We also, and I'm going to make the pitch that will cause several reporters I've spoken to groan, we need a functioning IRS oversight board to guide the service in its managerial decisions, not to micromanage its budget, but to bring successes and failures from the private sector to the fore in a structured fashion that they can learn from. And we have to reconstruct the great processes like the one that went into the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act. We have field hearings, experts, we build a consensus to move forward. We're doing that backwards here, but it's still got to happen. Several of you are going to be involved in a project with us to do just that.
Nina, you've got a minute.
So success is defined as the IRS is no longer at the bottom of the pack, as Pew reported, in terms of trust of U.S. people. That the trust in the IRS has increased as a result of this investment, and tied to trust, the most important measure to me is the voluntary compliance rate. What are people doing as a result of your compliance actions, as a result of your service actions? How are people responding longitudinally going forward? Are they voluntarily compliant as opposed to what they did in the past? And if you're not measuring your compliance measures, and I really dislike the word enforcement in that regard, whatever you're doing to increase compliance, then you're measuring that longitudinal effect, and that will measure your success. Was that under a minute?
That was under a minute, and with that answer. And thank you all so much. This has been really a great discussion. I'll remind you all that you want to watch this in reruns. It will be available on our website. And thank you all for coming, and especially my 4 panelists here. Bye-bye.